أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ومولانا أبا القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. The 15th of Rajab marked the wafat of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. And it is for us a duty to remember this distinguished and honorable lady, one who is known as Sharikatul Hussein alayhi salam, the partner of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who continued the message of Imam Hussein after his martyrdom. And during some of the toughest times, either in Kufa or in Sham, she was very patient, resilient. And sometimes when it comes to your mind, who's the most patient when it comes to Islam? One of the good examples is Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. But one cause of confusion for many, especially those living in the West, has always been, what is the role of women in Islam? What role should they have? When we look at one way to look at ladies is the Western way, and we figure out that what's going on in a Western non-Islamic context, we see that actually there is much suppression and oppression of ladies. Even though they claim for them to be the most free, the most protected, the most powerful, but actually when you look at some of the statistics, you see in the US, how many ladies are victim to domestic violence? Some of the figures say incidences of domestic violence reach 10 million in this country every year, 10 million. Many of them from obviously husband, beating, abusing the Western lady, abusing her, and these are incidences of oppression. Or when you look at other statistics, for example, you see that I don't want to open it too much because, this is the minbar, but what's going on after, the creation of social media, and that many in the US ladies sell themselves, for example, or sell photos of themselves online. Maybe the amount of accounts equals to about 4 million in the US, those who are showing themselves. As yet Islam says the opposite. It says to cover your zinat, for example, the adornment, that this is for example, for husband. But yet you see that there's also this subjugation. And the third that you see that causes confusion is that because of not knowing which role, because a wise Lord gives laws according to the qualities of that person, to the characteristics of that person. If one being is different in some manner, then they have other laws. If in some terms they are the same, then they have universal laws. We have this in Islam, ishtirakat, for example. When our ahkam and laws come in Islam, in the hadith or the verse of Quran says, for example, to men, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, it's masculine. We say this applies to ladies as well, because in this manner there's no difference. This is about religion, this is about deen. There's ishtirakat when it comes to the ahkam of men and women. Generally, when a ruling happens, even if that ruling is in masculine, for example, form in Arabic, we say this applies to the sisters as well, because there's no difference. But yet there are some rulings that are different because of how Allah has created. And therefore, you cannot deny this. Would you say that men are exactly the same as women and women are exactly the same as men? Obviously not. So if they are not, do they deserve separate rulings? Yes, just in some instances, right? So according to this, as we have the general leadership of the family is the men. Al-Rajal qawwamuna ala nisa. Men are in charge. As you know, in Farsi, they say when you have two chefs, for example, that food is either unsalty or it's salty, for example. One person has to be in charge. Who has the financial obligations in the household? The male does. The man does. who can work as well. The female can work as well, but that money does not have to be shared with the husband. That is hers to own. So therefore, you see, because of this confusion, and we'll say some of the roots of confusion, a lot of it starts from the Industrial Revolution. Female and male in this country are confused. Not only, obviously, in gender identity and all that, there's confusion, but the role that each one has. This has caused so much confusion because of income, because of working, because of the Industrial Revolution, that today some of the statistics in the US talk about 70%, 69, around 70% of divorces are initiated by the female. That I'm not trying to bring down female in this. What I'm trying to say is that interpretation and that belief of the role of women in society has been a failure so far in Western society. And therefore, we have to go and find another way, another system, and that is the system of Islam. When we look at Islam, and you look at the time period, Asr Tashri', when the Tashri' happened, legislation happened, you're talking about a time where the female was actually, not only was she looked down upon, some tribes would even bury them. Would all the tribes bury the female? No. Because if everyone did this, there would be no generation. There'd be no future generation. There'd be no kids. But some tribes did. In Quran, very sadly, Quran mentions وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ. Right? And when the girl who was buried alive is asked, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. With what sin was she killed? For what sin was she killed? See that in Islam, there was a time period of burying, and we read many harsh stories. Sometimes father taking the hand of daughter that is born, or maybe sometimes after a little bit, and burying, for example, daughter, and daughter thinking and trusting father so much, thinking that father is playing with her, for example, and burying her alive. These are some of the sins that some of the tribes would do. So how did Islam answer this? We see that Rasulullah has many traditions. We see that Islam gave so much importance to the female. One of the traditions we have is خَيْرَ أَوْلَادِكُمْ الْبَنَاتِ. The best of your children are the daughters. Daughters are good for you. Have daughters, for example. Do not abuse them. Do not be sad. Do not change your face. Quran mentions that their color of face would change. They would be upset when females were born. Or we see in the tradition, for example, mentioning that مَنْ عَالَ ثَلَاثَ بَنَاتٍ وَجَبَتْ لَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. Whoever has 3 daughters, for example, there will be heaven for her. But yet we see in the United States, some are looking around to see already who has 3 and who are those that are promised heaven. You can find them, inshallah. But when we look at the laws of ownership in the U.S., you see that one of the first states, Mississippi in 1839, was one of the first states granting married women the right to own property in their name. 1839. Was this full ownership of ladies of property? No, this happened later on. So we see that even in Islam, that 1400 years ago, a lady, we said, who works, a lady who inherits, this is her property in Islam. And Islam has already given these rights 1400 years ago, or the other prophets have given this. But this is something new. And some of the professors actually say maybe some of this law that happened in some of the states has an Islamic background, for example. It came into some of the European law, and some of the European law possibly came to the West. But this ownership is something that Islam had. But now let's look at one of the greatest blessings that Rasulullah had. At a time where everyone was bragging about how many sons they had, Rasulullah in Surah Al-Kawthar has been mentioned that, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar, that we have given you, abundance of khair and good. Because when they came to him and they said that you do not have progeny, for example, this verse came, Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar, fasalli li rabbika wanhar, inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. So you see that the progeny of Rasulullah, and whoever is Sayyid today, and is a family of Rasulullah, is by his daughter, by Fatima to Zahra. And I think this is very clear, especially in Shiism, that we have individuals like Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, like Lady Zainab alayhi salam, who we truly understand that there's no real difference when it comes to male and female, when it comes to spirit, because each are allowed to reach the highest of stations. And one of the highest of stations that we agree with is the station of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, and the intercession of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, and the connection between Risalat and Imamat of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. So therefore, it becomes very clear to us that when there are specific rulings and there are specific things that a lady or a male, for example, should focus on in masculinity or femininity, this is based on the fact of them being different, but the soul is the same. The soul nafs is nafsun wahid, and therefore, inna akramakum indallah atqakum. Whether you're male or female, the best of you is whoever worships Allah, whoever has the highest of piety. When we look at the ideal lady, what is the role of an Islamic lady in Islam? I think a very beautiful example is the example of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Many of us have still not understood what position she has. Especially in such a time period as today, that many of us are worried about her shrine and what is going to happen in Syria. We are concerned. But it's important for us to learn from her and see what is the ideal lady. Allama Mamiqani, a great scholar who wrote books of Rijal, for example, one of his books, even though it's biographers, in here he incorporates Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. And in this book, he talks about her. In his biography, he mentions her this way. Zainabun wa ma Zainab, and Zainab, and who is Zainab? Wa ma adraka ma Zainab, like Surah Al-Qad. And what do you understand, or how do you understand Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam? How do you understand her status? Basically, that we cannot truly comprehend what position she has, unless you're Imam Hussein, Imam Hassan, Sayyidah Fatima, Imam Ali, Rasulullah. She has a position higher than we can understand. First, he says, Hiya Aqila Bani Hashim, as a role model for us. We understand that she is Aqila, comes from Aql, for example. She is Alima, that is Ghayra Mu'allama. She has knowledge without being taught. And one of the first qualities that comes to this holy lady is her knowledge. And as a role model, that means that as ladies in Islam, females in Islam, knowledge is an important institution, or is an important part of our lives that they should have, or that our sisters should have. These traditions that we have, that ilm is farida, knowledge is farida, ala kulli muslim wa muslima, for example. This farida, fard of knowledge, it's not just for men, it's for females. Females also have to be educated. Females also have to have knowledge. And we understand here that she is alama ghayra mu'allama. But here we get into some of the specific attributes of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam that bring that femininity side, that is the side that ladies should have. And that is, وَقَدْ حَازَتْ مِنَ الصِّفَاتِ الْحَمِيدَةِ Allama Mamiqani says, وَلَمْ يَحُزُّهَا بَعْدَ أُمِّهَا أَحَدٍ. She has these special traits that nobody had after her mother, Az-Zahra alayhi salam. حتى حق أن يقال هي الصديقة الصغرى. It is the truth to say that she is the second Fatima to Zahra. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So these are part of the ishtarakat, knowledge, having fada'il. This is for men and female, it doesn't matter. But there are special rulings in Islam for females. And this is the part. Hiya fil hijab wal ifaf farida. She is, when it comes to hijab, chastity, covering yourself, and to chastity, she is unique. In what manner? He says, لم ير شخصها أحد من الرجال في زمان أبيها وأخويها إلى يوم الطاف. Nobody saw her except her brothers, for example, during the time of her brothers, her father, and her brothers, until Yawm al-Taf, until the day of Karbala. Nobody saw her. She was covered. So the Islamic lady, the Muslimah, is one of her fadila, if we say that Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam is a role model, is that she is covered. Just how Quran says very clearly in Surah Nur, that for ladies it's incumbent to hide their zina, the adornment, from others. And that for the male, it is incumbent to cover their eyes or to lower their gaze. When we look at this verse, we see that generally, male and female, when it comes to this matter, are different. Generally, men like to see, like to watch. And therefore, we can say from this verse of Quran that men are commanded to not look, because they can be, enticed or excited or corrupted in a way by their eyes and can lead them to fitna. In the same way, we see the Quran first talks about the male, then in Surah Nur talks about covering the zina, or talks about the khimar, taking the khimar, and the hijab khimar is like a scarf, and the way that Arabians used to wear generally, mushrikeen or mushrikat used to wear, like Africans, some of the African nations today, they used to cover their hair. And they would Quran says, take this, the verse is saying, take this covering and place it on your chest. If you're wondering why it says you cover your chest, because this is what our teacher, Ayatollah Shahidi, mentioned, that they would used to wear the hijab in this manner, and so it means to cover the chest. But then the Quran continues to not show your zina, for example, not show your adornment. We see different industries, one targeting male, one targeting female. The makeup industry, for example, many of the apparel, clothing industry, targeting women. Other industries, as on the minbar, I don't want to mention, but targeting men in advertisements and marketing using this part that men want to see. So we see, $1 trillion industry there, $1 trillion industry there, differentiating because one wants to show and one wants to see. Quran beautifully addresses both. It says, do not look, men do not look, and women do not show. Imagine a true society that men would not see and women would cover, how safe that society would be, and how far we've gone away. We said that the history of this and what is causing confusion is because of the Industrial Revolution. There were two industrial revolutions. The first, 1760 to 1840. The second, 1870 to 1940. Factories needed workers, and women were used in textiles or in factories that had, steam power in the first and in the second industrial revolution. And either from when steel production, electricity, chemicals, mass production happened, they needed laborers. They needed people to work. They needed to pay people cheaply because at that time, they would give harsh jobs to the ladies, and the ladies would work, men would work. But if you only limited the workforce to only, for example, men, then you're disregarding half of the other population. So this happened that because of industries, because of these big companies, they needed ladies to work. Now what has happened to modern man is that, and I'm not saying that working is haram, I'm not saying that because many today do not have the privilege of not working. You have to work in order to survive, especially today. Not only do you need 2 jobs, sometimes you need 3 jobs, 4 jobs, just to make it with inflation today. But if someone has that privilege, and as we said, that economic duty, we said it's balanced in Islam, that nafaqah, which is wajib, is upon the man. The man has to, it's wajib upon him, especially when you are married, you have a wife, you have children, it is wajib upon you to work. And also to take care of the parents as well. But that wujub in the family of nafaqah is not on the lady. So therefore you have ahkam and rulings that are specific. But what has caused this confusion is that after the Industrial Revolution, to promote work and cheap work and labor to sell, for example, goods and produce them, therefore what has happened is that ladies has caused them hardship. One, was that when this workforce participation would happen, they were paying women low paying for the salary, the amount of work they were giving. They were oppressing them when it came to their salary. When it came to home and family life, it became confusing because they were homemakers, they were mothers, they were educating their children, but at the same time they had to go to work and work long hours. So they had to do both, responsibilities. So therefore, they caused this shift in social status too, that now they're also earning income. And some ladies now today have incomes more than men. And now they're saying to themselves, why do I need men for example? Why do I have to listen to husband? My income is more than him, for example. So therefore, there causes this confusion. This is the reason for tonight's discussion, is to see what is the correct Islamic, from what we have from our role models, what is the correct role that women have. We see from the life and seerah of Rasulullah that his wife, Lady Khadija alayhi salam, worked. She had a job. She was actually very successful at it. And obviously there are ways to work today that have haya and mannerisms, or there are jobs and occupations that are needed for females. For example, doctors and different skills that women need to have in order to treat women, for example. This is a need in society. But Rasulullah, he did mudaraba, he worked, he had a partnership with his wife, Lady Khadija. And if God forbid, her business behavior was wrong, he would not be a partner if she had, for example, was selling something that is haram, or if she had a business practice that's haram. Rasulullah is infallible. He would not be a business partner of someone who's doing, obviously, haram at that time. So therefore, you see that it is very possible, as a side note, to have dignified occupations, to help. But this confusion is what exists in communities, that we don't know what should we do, how should we behave. And sometimes, unfortunately, we see young kids, young boys that are being raised, they are raised the same as young girls, for example. They're not taught that there's a masculinity part to men that you should be enhancing, you should be developing, for example. Also, a femininity side to the female. And also there are sides that are ishtirakat to both. That worship of Allah, knowledge, and all this is for both. But there are sides that as a community, we have to be able to focus and decipher what is the right response, the right outlook we should have. And I think that the best way is to look at our role models. And one of them is Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. So we'll continue about her fadilat and virtue. That one, we said about her intellect. We actually have about Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, that one of her name is Muhaddatha, meaning that the angel spoke to. The tradition mentions 75 days that Jibreel, the angel of Wahi, Jibreel wouldn't bring new revelation or a new book, or would come to Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, these 75 days. I believe the narration might be in Al-Kafi, that she would give, that Jibreel would give to Sayyidah Fatima, Ta'azzi, would give her condolences, would give her information about the whereabouts of her father, would give about information about what would happen to her children. That later on this book became Mus'haf of Fatima, that Imam Ali would write this. So we have knowledge that comes to Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, that becomes a separate book that's in the hands of the Imams. So these are actually things that knowledge and taqwa and piety, these are things that is for all. But again, we said one of the things that is absolutely needed in society is hijab and modesty. And one of them is Allama Maqani saying that nobody saw Sayyidah Zainab until the day of Karbala. No one saw her shakhs, nobody saw herself. And therefore, you see, as we say in the wafat of Sayyidah Zainab, it is sad that you see that, she herself comes and criticizes Yazid in the courtyard and says that you have covered, your own ladies, or Ibn Ziyad, but yet the daughters of Rasulullah are here exposed. Everyone is watching them, ambassadors, military men, everyone here is now watching them, seeing them. Or in some of the ziyarat, it mentions that the family of Imam Hussein, the family of Rasulullah, were paraded kal-abid, like slaves in the courtyards of Yazid. This, for us, is one of the saddest parts of the tragedy of Karbala, this the way that disgraced and dishonored all of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajal faraj. Salla ala Muhammad wa ali. So therefore we see this is a part that is separate, that ladies do not say. Some ask, then what is the hijab of men? How come men do not have to cover their, for example, hair? How come men do not have to cover their bodies, for example, to a certain extent? We said why? Because one of the understandings we have from Quran is that adornment and zinat needs to be covered from the ladies. The men have to focus, because they're designed differently, the men have to focus more on watching, and this is what we see today in these trillion-dollar industries. But when it comes to other parts of Sayyidah Zainab's life, and this is very important, is the Muslim lady one that is oppressed? Is the Muslim lady one that is weak? Because we said that image in the West of the Muslimah is one that possibly can be weak and oppressed. But we see that Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam was actually one of the most strong, was one of the most resilient, was one of those who, when she spoke to Yazid, she didn't speak as an asir, as a captive. She spoke as an amir. Why? Because she had no attachments to the world. She mentions, in the Allama Ma'maqani mentions about her, وَفِي الْفَصَاحَةِ وَالْبَلَاغَةِ كَأَنَّهَا تَفْرَغُ أَنْ لِسَانَ أَمِيرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ, as if she was a part of the tongue of Amir al-Mu'mineen, as how some of the narrators say, as if it's Imam Ali alayhi salam addressing the people of Kufa. كما لا يخفى على من أمعن نظر في خطبتها. When you look at her khutbah in Sham, when you look at her khutbah in Kufa, you see this. That even the animals at that time became absolutely silent. And then about her infallibility. وَلَا قُلْنَا بِعِسْمَتِهَا. This is a very interesting way to say this, because some ask, is Sayyidah Zainab infallible? Is she not infallible? We say we have 14 infallibles. What is the ruling on this? Allama Ma'maqani answers very interesting. He says, وَلَا قُلْنَا بِعِسْمَتِهَا لَمْ يَكُنْ لَأَحَدٍ أن ينكر أن كان عارفا بأحوالها في الطاف وبعدها. If we say she was ma'asum, he doesn't say she's ma'asum. He says if one were to say this, you would not reject it. You would not reject it, because being ma'asum means you don't do a sin. You do not make a sin. This is sometimes some of our ulama, about other ulama, they say, Fulani, what do you say about his idalat? Is he just? He says, I'm wondering about his isma, for example. Did he ever sin or not, for example? This just means not sinning. So yes, he says, if somebody were to say this, why would you reject? When you look at what happened in Taf, what happened in Karbala, and وَكَيْفَ وَلَوْ لَا ذَلِكَ لَمَا حَمَّلَهَا الْحُسَيْنُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ مِقْدَارًا مِنَ الثِّقْلِ الْعِمَامَةِ أَيَّامَ مَرَضَ Sajjad alayhi السلام. He says the time that when Imam Sajjad alayhi salam was sick, and she was taking part of the responsibility in Karbala. Why would you reject this? So therefore we have such a great station of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. Because we're running out of time, I have other parts, for example, of her speech. Maybe I'll read some parts of this strength of Sayyidah Zainab to also talk about the strength and the courage that a Muslim lady should have, especially when it comes to hijab, covering herself, practicing, because many times we have to admit this. When brothers go out, nobody really knows they're Muslim, right? Usually in our society, people don't wear this, for example, the hat. We go, we have a beard, and the beard is very trendy. Muslim, non-Muslim also has beard. This is something that happened, 5, 10, 20 years ago. It's actually very, something that is part of, likable in culture. But sisters are a representation of Islam. And if one person does not like Muslims, for example, they will be prejudiced. They will say something about sisters. So this part, sisters, listen up. It's very important to learn this part of being, the correct role model for ladies is the strength and resilience of Sayyidah Zainab. Look at how she addresses Yazid. When she sees Yazid and the way that he was making fun of the message of Rasulullah and mentioning some of the poetry about kufr, about disbelief, she tells Yazid with Quran, she uses many verses of Quran, ثُمَّ كَانَ عَاقِبَةَ الَّذِينَ أَسَاءُوا السُّؤَى أن كذبوا بآيات الله وكانوا بها يستهزئون. You're ridiculing Islam. You're talking about poetry, that Rasulullah wasn't a messenger. You're making fun and playing with the holy lips of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Then the final state of those who do evil was that they denied the signs of Allah and they used to ridicule him. Yazid, now that you are a disbeliever, it means because of doing dhulm and oppression, and your actions is causing you disbelief. Many of us, just a side note here, think that Islam is just an intellectual, research or decision we make. But actually in the traditions and the way of the Anbiya has always been by doing what is good, by having an intact heart, having a qalb salim, by performing the correct actions, having amal salih and having iman together, one preserves their faith. But if God forbid someone sins, takes away from them imamat. Someone sins, takes from them rasalat. Someone sins, God takes from them tawheed and the belief of God. She continues in other places that sometimes we ask, and some say, for example, look at what happened to Hussein ibn Ali. They ask, look, he was shaheed, he was killed. Is God with him or is God not with him? Or some ask, look at what happened today to the Palestinians and Gaza and genocide. Where is Allah right now to protect, for example, the innocents? Where is the truth? She answers and says, وَلَا يَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّمَا نُمْلِي لَهُمْ خَيْرٌ لِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Let not the faithless not suppose that the respite that we grant them is good for their souls, that God gives imhal to those that are faithless. God gives muhla in a time, or in other, for example, traditions and other terminology, God gives istidraj, meaning gives more capability for that oppressor, and He takes away His rahmah for them so that they can dig themselves more in sin. So do not think this muhla that we gave. Some like Pharaoh was giving a chance, was given power, but eventually his kingdom was crashed down by who? That son that he tried to, when he committed genocide and killed all the males, that same son that he raised came and overthrew him. And this is from the wisdom of Allah, one of the miracles of Allah. There are others throughout history that they had a time period of power, they had a time period of oppression, but eventually what you look as إِنَّمَا نُمْلِي لَهُمْ لِيَزْدَادُوا إِثْمًا. We give them respite so they can increase in sin, Quran says. So that eventually the tradition has إِن لَمْ أَنْ أَنْتَقِمْ أَنَا الظَّالِمْ فَأَنَا الظَّالِمْ. The Hadith of Qudsi says, if I do not seek revenge from the oppressor, then I am the oppressor. Eventually, dhulm will have its recompense, inshallah. So we see the life of Sayyidah Zainab in a way that she causes the Yazidi and the Khilafat of Umayyad eventually to fall down. And today I ask you this question: who has been successful? The followers of Imam Hussein alayhi salam or the followers of Yazid? When I went to New York last year, in Times Square, whoever wanted to go on the metro, it said, for 10 days or whatever, who is Hussein, for example. The movement of Who is Hussein sponsored a billboard, very expensive, but whoever was in Times Square and wanted to go on the subway at that time would research and see who is Hussein, would look at that. Do you have any movements of who is Yazid, for example, who is Muawiyah, for example? So therefore we see that whose movement was victorious? Obviously the movement of Imam Hussein, but what did it take? Perseverance and patience was a very important quality to have. And today we are seeing the same thing. I don't know if it's finalized or not, or what this, I don't really call it a ceasefire, because a ceasefire means there's a war, and a war means that both sides have armies. This is a stop to a genocide. It's a minimal step, but it looks like there will be eventually, I don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but he stopped to this genocide to some extent. Doesn't mean that the Palestinians will be free. It doesn't mean that they'll stop being oppressed. They'll continue. But a stop to this level of genocide that maybe in our own lives we haven't witnessed in video such things in our lifetime before. But we see that the resilience that the Palestinians had, and something that Islam talks to us about perseverance, about resilience, about patience, that none of them went, for example, on the Zionist side. None of them lost their iman. None of them lost their hijab, for example. And the same with the Lebanese. And the victory that the Lebanese have, inshallah, this will be shared with those that are in Gaza, inshallah. Because the traditions say, and they teach us, that when you have patience, for example, the tradition we have here, Inna nasr ma'as sabr, Rasulullah says, victory is with patience, endurance, perseverance. Wal faraj ma'al karb, wa inna ma'al usri yusra. And after difficulty, there is ease. Or Imam Ali says, for example, about the muttaqin, sabaru ayyaman qasira aqabathum rahatan tawila, rahatun tawila. Have patience for a little bit. Soon you'll have a long period in infinity of, inshallah, raha and comfort, inshallah. I'm going to end tonight with an interesting tradition from Imam Ali alayhi salam, and that is in Nahjul Balagha, that identifies, and this, we have other traditions possibly like this. But again, we said there's similarities in the personality, that, in femininity and masculinity, or similarities men and women have, but also differences. Imam Ali alayhi salam talks about 3 attributes that are good for ladies, but 3 attributes that are bad for men, for masculinity. And we have to understand it as well. He gives some of the, understanding Hikmah 234, and quoting the some, in some of the parts of the wisdom. خيار خصال النساء شرار خصال الرجال. The best, attributes of a lady are actually the worst attributes of men. Men should not be like this, women should be like this. الزهو والجبن والبخل. 3 things that are good for ladies to have, and I want you to think and try to understand this, beautiful book of Nahjul Balagha. 3 things. 1 is to be proud. 2 is to be al-jubn, for example, for a person to have fear, to some extent to have fear. And the 3rd is al-bukhl, to be cheap. These are actually good for ladies, but men do not be like this. So this is teaching us that there are attributes that females should have sometimes, that males should not have. And also opposite, I'm sure that there are other attributes like this, but these are 3. Why do you think that being proud and arrogant, in some aspects at least, some aspects, are good for the females? Imam Ali explains. فإذا كانت المرأة مزهوة لم تمكن من نفسها. She does not make herself accessible when she is confident, very confident, when she's proud. If she is going to lose her self-confidence, and anyone that demands something to her, do this, do that, for example, then she could be accessible, and this could lead to her harm. But if she is arrogant to them, for example, in the same way, when they come to ask them, she is arrogant and does not want to, accept their requests, then this causes her protection. So in some attributes, some examples that Imam Ali alayhi salam have, to be proud is good, but not for the male, for example. To be arrogant, to be in a way that, I'm better than everyone else here, this is not good. The second, again, now someone confused it, then you're saying that, for example, to think I'm better than someone else is good. No, these are in these aspects, at least that Imam Ali alayhi salam is giving an example of, when it comes to maybe other men. When in that interaction, when other men come, be proud of yourself. Be proud in a way that you're not accessible. He does not allow himself to want to start this conversation with you, to, cause harm to you, for example. Be proud. 2, وَإِذَا كَانَتْ بَخِيلًا. To be bakhila, bukhl is a tragedy. Some of the narrations say that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam would do tawaf and ask Allah to rid me of bukhl, of being cheap. This is something that is very bad, very unfortunate. Sometimes brothers, for example, go and they'll go for a meal and they'll ask, for example, waiter, can you take this bill and divide it by 100, for example? and each person gets, for example, their share of $1.99, for example. And they think, oh, this is fair, this is good, right, everyone? But this is not good, actually. You should be, in a way, be honored to treat someone to a meal, for example, to take your brother out. We have this in our Islamic culture, something we learn, but we think it's something maybe funny or whatever, that we say, we insist, please let me pay. The other says, please let me insist I pay. This is something good to some extent, as long as you don't fight and kill each other over it. But it is good to offer, for example, or to treat one another, to be generous with one another. This is one of the attributes of futuwa, of very good young men. But when it comes to this section, it says, why إِذَا كَانَتْ بَخِيلًا حَفِظَتْ مَالَهَا وَمَالَ بَعْلَهَا. Because then she is, again, look at the context again, because generally women would not work then. They would consume the money of their husband. So when she is careful of the way she spends, she is very moderating that family, for example, a budget that is available, for example, for her. وَإِذَا كَانَتْ جَبَانَةً فَرِقَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ يَعْرِضُ لَهَا. And when she is cowardly, she is cautious and fears, to be afraid. So very interesting, maybe you haven't heard this, that sometimes fear is good for ladies. I know an example of a lady that once was almost abducted, for example, was abducted in the US, in California. She had fear, she had a bad feeling that this van that parked next to her didn't have, for example, the windows, didn't have a license plate, and this van was too close, parked right, so if she opened the door, they could easily throw in. She had that fear. So what did she do? She goes and calls, for example, someone that works in that supermarket and says, can you escort me, help me with the groceries or whatever? Right then, when that van sees her, for example, come with another male, he skids off, peels off, and goes away. And the worker there says, oh, I heard rumors that they're abducting people, they're taking people. It's true. So therefore, having fear, to some extent, doesn't matter, again, don't be excessive on this and be so fearful that you don't go anywhere, but to some extent, be cautious. This will cause, for the female to be protected at the same time. But the male, inshallah, as you raise, for example, your boys and you have to also train them that masculinity, not to be afraid of others, not to be courageous, for example, to stand up. Again, some of this is for both men and women, as we mentioned, the example of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. Some of it is just, practical usage in our day-to-day lives. May Allah, inshallah, make us of those who preserve our masculinity, femininity, inshallah, and give us, inshallah, ziyarat of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, protect her shrine, give us shafa'at of her. Ya Allah, we ask you, because of this holy name, because of the Aqila of Bani Hashim, Sharikatul Hussein alayhi salam, cure our sick, inshallah, answer our du'as because of Sayyidah Zainab. Have rahmah and mercy, it's Thursday night, to our deceased, and inshallah expedite the return of the Imam of the age. Inshallah, make us of his companions with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajal farajah.